Okay, thanks everybody for joining. This is the second time I think that I'm doing this presentation on being a landlord, tips and execution. So, through this presentation, what I'm looking to do is I'm just kind of looking to share my own experience as a landlord. So don't take any of this as legal advice or legal opinion. I'm definitely not qualified to provide that. I'm just basically talking about things that I've experienced over 10 years and kind of the lessons that I've learned, both being a real estate investor since 2013 and being a real estate agent and also representing clients of mine that want to get their properties leased out, and then also being on the other side as well, working with tenants. So just because I'm in the space, I find it easy to talk about this. And our goal with these presentations is just to bring value. So the goal here is that you get more out of this presentation than the 45 minutes that you invested into tuning in. So a little bit about myself. So I'm a realtor with Remax Condos Plus in Toronto. My name is Zhvanetskiy. I've spent over a decade in Toronto's condominium industry before getting into this business. I worked as the vice president of a service provider company. So we tailored our services exclusively to Toronto's condominium industry. And through that, I've probably been in like every condo in the GTA at some point, whether it's to provide services or to provide a proposal or to do a walkthrough. I've done over 65 condominium assessments. I've been a real estate investor since 2013. I have a portfolio that consists of properties both in Ontario, which I self-manage, and now also in Alberta, which are managed by a property management company, which makes it actually very easy for me because sometimes I don't even remember that those properties exist until it's time to renew my mortgage, and then I contact Carmelo. And last year in 2022, I was in the top 1% of GTA condo sales from over 70,000 realtors that we have here in the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. If you want to connect, you can scan that little QR code in the bottom. My Instagram is alexz.realtor, but that's a QR code for my Linktree bio, where it has, webinars that I post about investing in Alberta, things that you probably have potentially attended since joining this Level Up community that Carmelo and I created. And we're also very excited to announce that we now have over 510 members in this community in just 4 months. So very excited about this. And that turnout, it does make us feel that we are bringing value for the audience. So really glad about that. So who is going to benefit from this presentation? So I want to just throw this out here because I want to let you know who this is targeted to and what I'm going to be talking about. So this is targeted towards newer landlords, predominantly in Ontario, but some of this is transferable. Probably actually most of it is transferable across the board, even probably to the US. It's just some of the legislation that I'm going to talk about and the forms that we use here for things like rent increases are from the Landlord Tenant Board in Ontario. Those thinking about purchasing and managing their first property are going to benefit from this. Managing their first investment property are going to benefit from this. And then anybody who's thinking about purchasing and having a property management company look after their property is going to be benefiting from this as well. And here are some of the topics that I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to talk about recruitment and selection and how to recruit, select, and attract, and how to get quality tenants for your properties. There's lots of tenants out there. We've had a pretty crazy population boom in Ontario right now. And Canada-wide, I think that last year we welcomed something like 500,000 new immigrants into Canada. Most settled in Ontario. Some went to Alberta and BC. So there's definitely lots of people that are looking to rent out space. And it's actually not a great environment that's been created right now. But as landlords, I think it gives us an opportunity to put roofs over people's heads. So there is a service, a valuable service that we're providing. I'm going to talk about managing day-to-day tenant expectations, and something that I like to use and use as an example is today's favor becomes tomorrow's duty. So you do something for somebody once, that's no longer a favor. It's going to be the new expectation. So just make sure you know what your rights and obligations are and how you want to manage your property. Like, for example, I had a client where her tenant reached out to her, said that the light bulb wasn't working in the kitchen. She drove over to the property, changed the light bulb, and now every time that little things like that happen, the expectation is that she's going to be doing that. So, I always have a schedule that I include with my standard leases, and I also communicate this far in advance to tenants so that they know what the expectations are. Any small repairs, I usually use a figure like $75, but I've had clients where we've gone up to $125. So anything up to that amount is going to be the responsibility of the tenant to look after. So, things like unclogging a sink, changing a filter, changing light bulbs. These are things on the tenant. Anything over that is on the landlord. And of course, there's a difference between, wear and tear or negligence. If it's something that's like a repair that's required because it's the negligence of the tenant, I'm going to talk about this a little bit deeper, but you want to have them take it through their insurance. I'm going to talk about knowing your rights, how to get information about your rights as a landlord, but it's also really important that you understand what are the tenant's rights, because you don't want to be in breach of that. Common practices, how to navigate things like rent increases, if you need to do a showing at a property, if your tenant's going to be vacating, what is the process for that? And also, last but not least, making sure that you hire qualified third-party experts. So whether that's to get information from, don't take legal advice from your neighbor. Don't have Joe the handyman coming in and doing plumbing work in your condo, because they're not insured to do that type of work. And then if there's a flood, basically you're going to be on the line. And just source it out.
So Alex, you're telling me I can't really ask my mechanic some advice when it comes to what to do with my tenants?
You can ask your mechanic whatever you want, but treat it with a grain of salt and understand that they just have their own perception. Like I recommend that you do have contact information for a paralegal if there's any serious landlord-tenant issues that come up that you need some legal advice from. At least ask a real estate agent. But even for me, like if somebody asks me something that's outside of the Residential Tenancies Act, or if it's like stated in there, but it's something like that you have to navigate through, I would always tell you that's outside of my scope as an agent.
The key thing I get out of this is really speak with an expert with a specific situation.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, you're running a business, right? And there's liabilities that can be coming with it. Like if you have a tenant that's living in an environment that's not healthy, well, the liability is on you as the landlord to provide a healthy environment to them, right? So you don't want to be getting in legal trouble. So make sure that everybody has an opinion, right? But what is it worth, right?
Got it.
Yeah. So I guess the first part that I'm going to talk about is where to find tenants. So there's a few solutions. So as a landlord, you can definitely just like market the property yourself. You can put ads on Facebook, Kijiji, Craigslist. I mean, I've had I've seen ads in buildings. There are some condos, especially, that I've seen where tenants kind of cycle through the building. So their landlord sells the property. They want to move into a unit in the same building because they like the sense of community that exists there. So you can use things like signage in the lobby. But from my experience, and I guess I have a little bit of a bias in this, but when you're recruiting quality tenants, it's always easier to work with a real estate agent, because we can place your property on the MLS. Like for myself, anytime that I list a client's property, I'll include professional photos. I do basically all the screening for them. The caliber of tenants that you get through a realtor is also of a much higher grade, because you kind of have like two agents that are vetting them. So you have the tenant agent, like that's representing the tenants, that's actually going to vet who they're working with, and they're not going to be working with somebody that they don't think that they can get a property for. And at the same time, you have your agent that's in the business doing this on a full-time basis and is vetting that tenant. Like I've had some pretty challenging situations before where I've caught things like tenants applying with fraudulent documents, for example. So that's something where I don't know what their intention was, but we were able to identify, and as a result, we didn't move forward with those tenants. But there are, if you're not careful, you don't know where to look or how to properly screen through it, you could find yourself with not the same person who you thought you were approving to move into your property.
So Alex, you do all that work for me if I'm looking for a tenant in my property. I don't have to really look at these things or do these extra searches that you're going to be doing.
You can, but I would do the due diligence for you as the landlord, and then I would just basically present you, okay, like this is the offer, this is the person, this is their bio. Do you want to move forward or not? Ultimately, it's the landlord's final decision who they move forward with or not. But I would do basically all the vetting and all the pre-screening, and at the same time, as a real estate agent, we also carry like liability insurance as well. So if you haven't,
So all the showings, all that paperwork, all that day-to-day stuff, you're filtering it through. I wouldn't have to do any of that.
Yeah. So usually if the property is vacant, we would just like set up a lockbox, and other agents would come in with their clients to do the showings, or I would even be the one that would talk to the existing tenants to arrange that. So basically like, if you have tenants in the property and they're moving out, I would just reach out to them, say, I'm representing Carmelo, and we're going to be looking for new tenants. I would set everything up automatically to kind of do all the back and forth with them to make sure that showings can happen. So it's very much you're not involved until the end. But once the lease has been signed and the tenant has moved in, now it's your turn to take over as a landlord.
I love
Unless you have property management.
I love it, Alex, because it saves so much time having to deal with these, Facebook, Kijiji inquiries and showings and all that work's being passed on to you.
Yeah, and having to drive to the property and the people don't show up and
yes.
So forth. Yeah. So here are some questions. If you're going to be vetting your own tenants, here's some questions that I would want to ask. So I always want to ask, what do people do for work? How many people intend to reside in the property? I always ask these up front. If I'm renting out a condo, I also ask about pets, because condos, like pretty much all condos, have pet restrictions. There's no condos that just allow pets as a blanket statement. And what I mean by that is that most of the restrictions are around how many pets you can have in a unit, the size of dogs, but there are condos that are totally like they don't allow pets at all. They're pet-free condos. So make sure that if your condo is a pet-free condo, you're disclosing that appropriately, because the last thing you want is a tenant to move in and then maybe they get a pet after and then they find out they can't have them. Make sure that I always ask what their intended move-in date is to make sure that it's aligned with when the property is going to be vacant. I also ask them what their credit score is. So I don't necessarily ask, like sometimes these questions may be a little bit challenging to ask, but not everybody is comfortable asking, what's your credit score? What's your income? What do you do for a living? So usually the way that I treat it is I would just basically tell them like, look, as part of the process, these are the documents I'm going to require. I'm going to require an employment letter. I'm going to require 2 pay stubs. I'm going to require a government ID, credit score. And this is going to be for all occupants in the property, anybody over the age of 18. If it's students, then they can just send me confirmation of enrollment. And you're also going to need to complete a rental application. Is this going to be okay for you? Do you have any questions about that? And then I would maybe further tell them that, I'm looking for tenants that have a credit score of maybe this caliber. So I'm not asking them about their personal stuff. It's more just like I'm making a statement, like this is what our expectations are. And please let me know if this is okay for you. And if it's not, then they can move on. But I always also will send them an email ahead of doing any showings, and just like kind of like, outlining documents required, making sure that they're okay to provide that. And if I'm going to be driving somewhere to do a showing, like if it's in one of my properties, I'm going to want to see some of this stuff up front. Like they may not be able to provide everything up front, but our completed rental application, I want to know where the people are working, because last thing I want to do is like drive somewhere, show somebody a property, they're really interested, we start to build a rapport, and then when they send me their documents, it's not somebody that I would have considered. It's not fair to them as well, getting their hopes up in such an aggressive rental market.
So Alex, again, like it really sounds like you're setting the expectations, right? With regards to what you're going to be asking for. Mm-hmm. What documents would you get up front? Is it just only the application, or do you kind of put an option or a request of like a minimum up front, or you just set the expectation before you show them a property?
So it depends. Usually I ask up front, especially if I'm an agent and I'm working with tenants. Like if I'm representing a tenant, I would usually tell them like, listen, I don't want to waste your time. I want to make sure that the property that I'm showing you, I can actually help you get. This is what I require. But if there's some pushback, or if people say, you know what, I'm not comfortable providing this, I mean, that's completely okay as well. Like not everybody's going to want to send their credit report to a stranger, right? So Usually I kind of just do like some of my own due diligence, like maybe like look them up on LinkedIn, or to just kind of make sure that they are in line with who they say they are. I tell them like this is all that I will be required, and I go from there. So it's not like there's no I ask, but if they don't want to provide, I just kind of tell them like, okay, that's fine, but if when you do provide, it's not this, I'm not going to be able to help you.
So it's kind of like there's no golden rule. It's just kind of you feel them out, you set the expectation, and you based on how they respond is how you move forward.
Yeah, and a lot of this, like, even like feeling out the person, because the person may be a great applicant on paper. Like they may have a good job, they may have good credit, but you also have to see how you get along with this person, right? Because ultimately you're going into like a landlord-tenant relationship with them. You want to make sure it's somebody that you can communicate with and you're comfortable communicating with. Like I've had landlords where, we had good tenants, but then when we meet them for like a Zoom call and like the way that they communicate, just like this is not going to work out. Right? So it's like it's kind of like you want to create a fine balance of everything, but ultimately, you want to be going into something that's win-win for both parties. Like ultimately the landlord and the tenant, like they all have to feel comfortable communicating with each other, and just be upfront with all the expectations. But these documents, like this is all standard. So like if somebody's looking to get a property to rent, they're not going to be able to rent anything without this, at least not through a real estate agent. Maybe if they go to the landlord directly, they can do that, or if they're finding some other like housing solution, like maybe they're like renting a room somewhere or something like that. Like maybe they're not so picky about this stuff, but anybody that works with an agent, credit report, pay stubs, and also I do my own credit report too. So when I'm representing a landlord and I get their credit, like the client's credit report or the tenant's credit report, as a condition of accepting that lease, I also have my brokerage do our own Equifax report on them, and I match it up as kind of like an extra step of due diligence to make sure that it's the same and it has the same reporting information on there and the same credit inquiries, because there's a lot of really good Photoshop people out there. Like there's that scenario. I know I've shared that with you, but I think maybe it'll be valuable for the people that are attending here. I had somebody that applied to rent out my client's property, and they had pretty good income, like 6-figure income, good credit, and so forth. And then I looked up the company online, because I don't actually ever call the person who's on the employment letter. I will look up the company and I contact the company directly and ask to speak to human resources. But when I looked up this company, I found that this company only had one employee, and that employee was the same person who wrote the employment letter. And then when I did a reverse Google image search on that person, I found out that it was an artificial intelligent AI generated picture of a man. Like it's called AI generated picture of man too. So like this was completely fraudulent. And then I also had somebody submit the same documents to me for a different applicant on a different property, like a few months later.
So there's a Mr. Smith going around or something like that with the same applicant, same profile, that's just going around looking for places to rent.
Yeah, and even like the company's phone number, when you call it, it's like a 1-800 whatever. Like it's like a number you call, and it's an actual like answering service that answers the call.
So it's important to do your due diligence, not just take everything at face value.
100%.
You got to go a little bit behind, behind the scenes and look things up.
Yeah, and one tip that I'm going to give is like when you see a company's address, like whatever, like you look up a company, ABC company, and they give you a specific address. Do a reverse search on that address and see if there's any other businesses that are registered in that address. Because if it's just like a PO box or a virtual office somewhere, that should be an indication where you have to do some further due diligence. Like I understand startups use virtual offices sometimes, but also like see what kind of business is this, and does it make sense that they're in a virtual office? Also
Google Street View.
Yeah, Google Street View and see what you're looking at. There's so many resources right now, but it goes both ways. So that's one of the things that is a little bit scary, because it's you have to like really take precautions and do all these extra steps. And for me, it's like if something doesn't make sense, that's it.
But these are great things, because once these things come up, it's very easy to identify and you move on.
100%.
You're not getting someone in there that's all of a sudden going to be possibly a bad tenant.
Yeah. And it's like you have to know kind of what to look for, right? So I hope that the audience have found some of this back and forth and this story informative, because this stuff does happen a lot. It seems like now it's like if somebody's going to be sending you printouts of their employment documents that they took pictures of with their cell phone, that's like more that's like more credible. So yeah, let's move on. So yeah, okay, I hear Spider-Man with his spidey sense going up, right? So just like when you're doing a background check, when I do a background check, I don't just check the tenant. I don't focus on the tenant. I actually focus on the people who I'm doing a background check on. Oh, and another thing that I do as a real estate agent is if somebody tells me that they were living at, I don't know, 123 Front Street, Unit 501, and their landlord was Carmelo Boutis, I'm going to go into the land registry office. I'm going to see does Carmelo Boutis actually own 123 Front Street, Unit 501? And that's something that as just like a regular person, you wouldn't be able to do. You don't have access to that. But I basically use like all resources that I have available to me, up to like if I have a shared LinkedIn contact with that person, I'm going to reach out to them and be like, hey, do you know this person?
That's great.
So,
it's good to find out and get all the details.
100%, man. And I mean, maybe it's a little bit paranoid, but I mean, this paid off a few times. Like so.
It's not paranoid. It's doing due diligence. You're having somebody come into your unit.
Yeah, 100%.
You want to know everything about them.
Yeah, that's what it is. So, like I mentioned, like don't call the person on the employment letter. Call the company directly, like through their. Like, don't even worry about talking to the person on employment letters. Call, say you want to speak to human resources, you want to do an employment verification for this person, and then verify it that way. I do Google, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all those searches. And don't just call the most recent landlord, because if you call the most recent landlord, they may give you a good reference because they want to get rid of this person. Call the landlord before the most recent landlord. And if it's not on the rental application, ask for that. It's a standard on the rental application. Again, if you want a rental application, feel free to reach out to me. I know Carmelo's posting those links in the chat. And by the way, like if anybody wants to kind of have a more in-depth call, I know Carmelo's going to book a link there to do a 15-minute call through Calendly. So if you want to just kind of talk about being a landlord, happy to answer that. So just make sure that things make sense. That's kind of what it is at the end of the day. And tenant rights. So make sure you know what tenants' rights are. So the Residential Tenancies Act is accessible and available to us all online. Again, if you want the link, send me a DM. Happy to share that with you. There are standard documents that you need to provide. So for example, the Ontario Standard Lease. A lot of landlords may not know that if you don't use the Ontario Standard Lease, if your tenant requests it and you don't provide it within 21 calendar days, they can withhold 1 month's rent until you provide the Ontario Standard Lease. Make sure that you have the contact information of a paralegal that you can contact and ask questions and get some sage advice from. And laws do change, so keep be informed of what's happening and kind of like what's in the news. The Ontario Standard Lease. Make sure that you document on the lease who's responsible for what. So who's paying for what utilities. If there's something like snow removal, if it's a single family home, make sure you document that the tenant's paying for that. Now, if you have a property that's a duplex, like you have a tenant living in the basement and another tenant living on the main floor, the snow removal or grass cutting, you can't put that on one tenant. So in those scenarios, you got to source that out to a third party company. Unless you kind of talk to them and maybe give them you can hire, maybe see if you can hire one as an employee to do that or kind of go around that, but they have to be okay with that. And so I have an additional schedule that I normally use, and it talks about things like the exterior maintenance that I just touched on, interior maintenance like air filters and little things like unclogging sinks and minor repairs. Key deposits, so make sure you document how many keys they get. And in condos, the key deposit, like it should be reasonable. It should be $200-300, whatever it will cost for a locksmith or the condo corp to cut you a new key and change the lock. So you can't just like make it anything you want. And also you can't hold the key deposit as a damage deposit. In fact, in Ontario, damage deposits are just not permitted at all. And in Alberta, they're allowed, but here they're not. And then if there's any special rules like, parking or who parks where, make sure that you document all that in your schedule.
So Alex, all details with regards to like the fine print, smoking, parking, pets, it's all identified. It's good to have it in writing.
Everything.
So from like who's paying what utilities to pets to repairs, you put it all in there.
Everything is in writing. So a lot of this is covered in the lease. So for example, smoking rules, key deposits, these things are covered in the Ontario standard lease. But things like being responsible for repairs up to $50 or other things, like anything that's not covered in there, you can put that in the schedule. But now you have to make sure that what you're putting in your schedule is actually legal, because if you put terms that are illegal in your schedule or in your lease, they're not enforceable. So you can't supersede the Residential Tenancies Act.
You got to keep it simple too, right? Like you can't just be asking for all these things, right?
Yeah, you have to put legal things in there, because if you put things that are illegal, then they're not enforceable and they don't mean anything. So, that's something too. So for example, like in condos, right? So pet restrictions or pet policies for landlords are actually not enforceable. So even if a landlord, says that they don't want any pets, as long as the condominium corporation permits those pets, there's not much that they can really do. I mean, they can deny a tenant based on that and just not disclose to them why they're denying the tenancy. But at the same time, as long as the condominium corporation permits that pet and that pet is not causing damage to your unit, you can't really do anything about that. If the tenant moves in and you don't know they have a pet, and then you come in and do an inspection and all of a sudden they have a small dog or a cat, not much you can do about that if the condo permits that. You can't you can't evict them over that. So
especially if they get it afterwards.
If they get it afterwards, but some people just don't even disclose it. So that's why, doing due diligence and kind of looking things online. So if somebody's, says they don't have any pets, and I go on their, you kind of look on their Facebook and they have a picture of them and they're like a bulldog or something, then maybe, you want to kind of confirm that. But then again, it's like, you never know what happened. Maybe that's their family animal. Maybe they aren't going to move in with that. So basically these pet provisions and pet rules, like as much as landlords like to kind of put that stuff in, there's not much you can do about it. One exception that may be okay is, for example, if it's a furnished unit and the landlord has a severe pet allergy. But even then, in those kind of scenarios, even though damage deposits are illegal for furnished units and things like that, damage deposits are kind of acceptable. So it's a bit of a gray line, but people kind of understand that if they're, coming into a unit that's furnished, there's going to be some sort of deposit for that. But even then, it's not enforceable. But a lot of stuff that I see on MLS, like people advertising furnished units, they have a damage deposit.
So talk about rent control, because this is something that's actually changing when it comes to like with the rise in interest rates and mortgage payments for the landlords.
Mm-hmm.
How does it work with landlords talking to the tenants with regards to rent increases?
Right. So, we have rent control in Ontario, but it's only valid for properties that were first occupied for residential purposes prior to November 15th, 2018. So anything that was occupied after that, so like new condos, for example, there's no rent control in those buildings. So the landlord can essentially increase the rent whatever amount they want. Now they got to kind of keep it as, in line with market rent, or nobody's gonna rent out that property. But like any properties before that, the government of Ontario, like the province, they set out what the maximum rent increase can be. So last year for 2023, and I think for 2024 also, it's 2.5%. Now there are some ways that you can increase your rent more than that, but you have to actually make an application and you have to get an approval, for that to happen.
So the increase, from my understanding, is really if the building or the use of it prior to the November 15, 2018, that a building's like that is built before then is going to be under rent control. But a lot of these new constructions, whether it's a house or a condo that are built afterwards or being occupied afterwards, because the condo could be in the middle of being built, right, and just closes before, but there's no occupancy. You're allowed to, you have flexibility when it comes to increasing rents.
Yeah, you have a flexibility to increasing rents. You can increase it to, I guess basically anything you want. And that's, for tenants, a lot of tenants seek out units that are, of course, in rent controlled buildings for that reason. So, But it seems like it doesn't really affect the rents anyways, because whether the unit's in a new building or a rent controlled building, there's so much demand right now, and some people want to live in a new building, like they want to kind of like be the first person to live in that unit. So it doesn't really affect like it should. Like when you think about it logically, it should impact what the rent control building should be a lot more desirable. But frankly, with how hot the rental market is, tenants just are not really concerned with that right now. Like especially this summer, like it's been crazy aggressive in Toronto, especially. So yeah.
That's important to know for those looking to invest in rental property.
Yeah, because if you buy a new property, you can then, you go to renew your mortgage, and now you're paying substantially more. You can increase your rent to counter that.
Yeah, something to consider when looking.
100%. So there's a form that you're supposed to provide. It's called an N1. I just put a kind of a screenshot of that. This is the form you're supposed to provide to tenants for a rent increase. It's pretty straightforward, but it does always, like any landlord tenant form, it's going to have the tenant rights in here as well. So it's going to tell them, what their rights are. There's a hotline that tenants can call as well. The hotline doesn't actually give legal advice, so it's like very strange what this hotline is for. But like when you call them and you ask them a question, they say, we don't give legal advice. But okay, so it's like a little bit wishy-washy sometimes, but they do have a hotline. So in the lease also, like it says things like after a year you don't have to sign a new lease. So like it tells you, like all the rights are explained in the forms. They're really easy to use and understand.
And how much notice do you have to give a tenant with regards to a rental increase?
So you need to give 90 days notice to a tenant, and you have to make sure that that's aligned with when the tenant actually pays rent. So like, let's say October to November, December. Okay, so let's say I want to give Carmelo an increase from January 1st, and he pays rent on the 1st of the month. I have to give him that increase October 1st, the latest. If I give it to him on October 10th, well, now his rent increase is going to be from February 1st because the 90 days is going to be from November 1st. So yeah, make sure that you're also kind of, putting this in your calendar.
So it would be safe to give him a little bit more than 90 days. You don't want to wait till the last day because things happen.
Yeah, things happen, exactly. So yeah, you want to give that. Some other final tips about, tenants and moving in, and final tips and stuff. So I always recommend that you do a walkthrough of the unit with the tenant. You document any damages, you take pictures, you maybe send them and yourself an email of any deficiencies or the state of the unit, kind of benchmarking it and timestamping it. Have them confirm that and sign. But I mean, if you just send them an email, it's already timestamped, so that's sufficient as well. Get a copy of their tenant insurance beforehand. 1 million is the absolute minimum. I recommend 2 million liability. And basically the purpose of tenant insurance is it protects you as a landlord. So if your tenant, let's say, causes some damage and they flood the unit underneath you, well, their insurance will be the one that will be responsible for paying that. It's not going to go through your insurance as a landlord. It's not going to make your premiums go up as a result. So it protects your insurance as a landlord. The key deposit should also be provided before tenancy. Post-dated checks, landlords request this. They're actually not legal to request post-dated checks. Tenant doesn't have to provide post-dated checks. They can do e-transfer. So usually what I do is in my schedule, I would just put like, e-transfer will be paid on the 1st of the month before 12 p.m. every 1st of the month. And also prepaid rent is also not permitted. So if a landlord requests, and there was some case law about this. So if a landlord requests prepaid rent, so let's say, you have a tenant that's going to move in, and you say, okay, I'm going to rent to you, but because you're a student, I want 6 months up front. And they go ahead and they provide that. They can request that money back. They can request that prepaid rent back. Now, it's different if you didn't request anything and the student just voluntarily came and said, hey, I'm a student, I don't have a job, but I'm going to give you 6 months rent up front to show you that I can pay rent. That's a different story. But if the landlord blatantly requests it, they can find themselves in a situation where the tenant can ask for it back.
So if you receive an offer when you're viewing vetting tenants, where the offer comes with 3 months rent in advance, that's okay, as long as you're not asking for it.
As long as I'm not asking for it. If they want to give me 3 months, 6 months, I've had a year, that's okay. I never recommend to my clients that they consider prepaid rent over the general caliber of the tenant. Like it should not be a substitute because, okay, they give you 6 months up front. And then what? Like after that, they're still your tenant living in your unit. They give you a year up front. They don't have to leave after 1 year. The tenancy goes month to month. Like the only way that a tenant can actually leave your property is if you have a family member that's going to be moving in, or you're going to be moving in yourself, or you sell that property and then the person who's buying it wants vacant possession. Otherwise, they can just stay in the property. So, don't, let 1 year of upfront rent, make you look past some red flags, I guess,
So
is kind of what I'm trying to say.
don't get blinded by the carrot.
No, don't get blinded by the carrot. Exactly. Some final tips. So, it's a relationship. The tenant is your client. So, maintain a good relationship, pick your battles as well. If it's sometimes like, you get more bees with honey. So being nice and, the kind of like looking after your property and making sure that you're providing a safe, comfortable environment for your tenant goes a really long way. But also, within reason. Like, remember, today's favor, tomorrow's duty. Like I said in the beginning of that example of the light bulbs. Anything, you want to get everything in writing. So emails, like text messages, are not great. Emails are a lot better, but anything that's kind of like official, like ending tenancy, rent increase, if a tenant causes damage, and you are going to be, you can, that's one of the ways actually you can get a tenant to leave, to evict them, is if they cause damage. So like make sure that you're using the proper landlord tenant board forms for that. Make sure that you also switch your insurance policy to a landlord insurance policy. So make sure that your insurance company knows that you are renting out the property. I also recommend that you do the rent increases every single year. At least the minimum, like if it's a rent controlled property, at least the minimum 2.5%, because expenses do come up. So, do your rent increases, you're entitled to that. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of our presentation here. So I'm just going to unshare my screen. I'm going to open it up to any questions.